Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review on APUSH Unit 13, the Great Depression and the New Deal. Looking at our review sheet from top to bottom, Hoover's reason for minimal intervention in the economy before losing to FDR in 1932. Well, remember, Hoover is basically a conservative Republican, part of the laissez-faire economics of the 20s, and he believes that welfare, he believes that government intervention and assistance would damage the American character, would wound American independence and self-sufficiency. But we should keep in mind here, for the time, he is pretty radical in some ways. Namely, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation gives millions of dollars to businesses, to banks, to insurance companies, to corporations to keep them afloat. A little bit of this trickle-down economic idea that you see later under Ronald Reagan, that if you keep the businesses going, that they will keep employment going. So the RFC continues under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Often doesn't make a lot of history books, but it's one of the bigger government interventions that continues to give money to businesses to keep them afloat. The Bonus Army is a group of 20,000 vets who march on World War I vets who march on Washington, D.C. to urge Congress to give them their bonus, which was promised earlier. The bonus was supposed to be paid out in 1948. And being unemployed, they're asking that Congress pass legislation to give them this promised bonus earlier. And in 1932, Hoover initially treats the Bonus Army, these men, these World War I vets who show up in D.C., he treats them pretty well. He has the Army give them tents and cots and give them rations. And as more and more of these men come, some of them are in the way, in the streets in D.C., and they're sort of squatting in government buildings. And Hoover finally decides to have the Army evict them. And the Army at this time, the Army in the D.C. area, wherever that base would be, is General Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur goes kind of overboard. He beats on these guys. He burns their tent city down along the Anacostia Flats, along the Potomac River. And it's kind of a brutal send-off to these vets. And this wasn't Hoover's intention, but Hoover basically has to take the rap here for the harsh eviction by MacArthur. It's one of these things that's not very good PR as you're running for re-election in the face of a depression which starts in 1929. So when FDR is elected, when he is inaugurated, he initiates what's called the New Deal. The New Deal is this program of relief, recovery, and reform. And you'll see these three R's often on in AP books and history books, on study sites. And the ideas here in short are: relief is short-term help, giving somebody a job, say, in one of these job programs. Recovery is how to bring the American economy back online, to bring it back to good health so that it'll employ people and the government doesn't have to run job programs. And reform refers to fixes to the system so that you don't have an economic collapse in the future. So some select programs which will be on the test here, guys. The Glass-Steagall Act is an act which will divide commercial banks from investment banks. And commercial banks, think of banks that loan money basically to homeowners. And these are banks which are not allowed to speculate. They're not allowed to gamble their money on risky ventures. The investment banks can. And what happened was the stock market crash is largely caused by speculative loans and investments. And the Glass-Steagall Act, up until Bill Clinton is in office, you don't have major bank collapses. This is done away with under Clinton with full Republican backing, and the banks speculate wildly. And some of you are aware, in 2008 we've got the second biggest crash since the Great Depression, largely because of the banks. We took the brakes off the limits. Maybe a little editorial comment there, but Glass-Steagall divides the banks into commercial safe banks and investment banks. SEC is the Securities Exchange Commission, which is a government watchdog over the stock market to make sure that investments are on the up and up and that investors are not being hoodwinked. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, will insure bank deposits so that you don't have runs on banks anymore where lines of people pull all their money out and banks collapse. The FDIC initially will insure deposits up to $5,000. And at the time, the average income in the 1930s is about $1,200 a year. HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, what this does is it refinances loans. The short of this is to refinance a loan means you get to pay a reduced, not a reduced total what you owe, but you get to pay a reduced payment. The payments go down and the interest goes down, so your payment goes down. And this is going to help keep 1 million people from being evicted who can't pay the original mortgage. The CCC is the Civilian Conservation Corps, and about 3 million young men are going to work in the woods. They're going to work in wilderness areas, planting trees and fighting forest fires and building nature trails and setting up picnic shelters and building campgrounds. And this is a very popular program with the public. The AAA is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which is going to subsidize farmers to grow less. Basically, the idea is if you grow less, if you plow under your, say, your cotton crops and slaughter some pigs and you just don't grow as many crops, this will force prices up. The TVA is the Tennessee Valley Authority, and this is a plan to dam the rivers in Appalachia and to use those dams for hydroelectric power. And the idea is cheap electric power will entice businesses to move to the poorest part of the country and build factories to employ the Appalachian poor. These dams will also provide flood control and will provide water areas for recreation. The NRA, remember the NRA is the National Recovery Administration, and what this is a plan to allow businesses to get together and kind of dodge the anti-monopoly laws and to collude, to conspire, to plan that as an industry they can set up codes and rules for everybody in it. And the plan is to give business free rein to get back on their feet. What do workers get? Workers get Section 7A, which allows what's called collective bargaining. Basically, think labor unions. It also sets up minimum wage and maximum hours. The WPA is the Works Progress Administration, which over the course of its life employs like 8.5 million people on jobs projects such as sidewalks and roads and bridges and things like that, and federal buildings. And it's also noted it gives jobs to artists, it gives jobs to actors and to orchestra members and to history teachers writing history books and to puppeteers and people involved in the arts. And it's very similar to two other programs that aren't on the review sheet here, the Civil Works Administration and the Public Works Administration. These are basically just jobs, having people mixing cement and getting their shovels and sidewalks and roads and what have you. The Social Security Act of 1935 is basically old age pensions for the elderly, disability for the injured and handicapped. And initially this includes unemployment benefits for those who are unemployed. The FLSA, the Federal Labor Standards Act, is going to set minimum wage and maximum hours and overtime, and this is going to follow the Supreme Court's nullifying the NRA. This is going to be a replacement for that, for Section 7A. The Wagner Act is going to also follow the nullification of the NRA by the Supreme Court. And the Wagner Act is specifically going to allow collective bargaining, and basically this is workers negotiating with management. This basically gives the green light to labor unions. Why did FDR turn towards more permanent changes after 1936? Well, he's got a conservative Supreme Court which has struck down the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, and the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And he has leftists on his left, such as Huey Long, who are arguing for more active government intervention. You've got Dr. Francis Townsend, who's arguing for old age pensions, and you've got Father Coughlin, this radio priest, who's arguing the government should intervene more actively and actually nationalize businesses. And what's going to happen is FDR is going to basically co-opt these guys. For example, Huey Long and Dr. Francis Townsend, who are arguing for Social Security, well, FDR, is going to implement this, is going to get this passed. And things that are permanent are such as the labor union law, the Wagner Act, and the Federal Labor Standard Administration, which sets minimum wage, maximum hours, and overtime rules. The Supreme Court is going to, in striking down the NRA and the AAA, after 1936, FDR is going to be reelected by just a huge landslide, and he's got massive majorities in the House and in the Senate. He has Democratic allies who've been passing all these laws, and he feels he has a mandate. He has the power to basically change the Supreme Court. And remember, the President and the Congress, they cannot fire anybody on the Supreme Court, and they can't cut their pay. But they can pass a law to add members to the Supreme Court. And that's just what FDR does. It's called the court packing scheme. He asks for 6 new justices. He asks for the power to add justices for anybody who's over 70 on the court. And his argument is for efficiency, to help these old guys get the work done. But really, he's packing the court. And what's really surprising is a sympathetic Congress does not do this. They do not let the president upset the balance of power, this idea that you have a Congress, a president, and a Supreme Court that balance each other. Something which is kind of amazing that this does not happen. So the president does not get his way. It's called the court packing scheme. The Roosevelt recession, the president cut spending in 1937. Unemployment has dropped from something approximately from 25% down to maybe 17 or so percent. So the president feels that over the course of his first term, things are improving. He can take his foot off the gas. He cuts the WPA. He is going to stop, he's going to reduce spending. And for the first time, Social Security taxes are going to take a bite out of people's paychecks, and unemployment spikes. It spikes back up to something like 20% or so. And don't worry about the specific numbers here, but you have a recession in the middle of a depression, which kind of shows how much the country at this point depends on government spending. And you should know the difference between the AFL and the CIO. Neither of these are government programs. Remember, the AFL, we covered this back in the unit on labor unions. The AFL is a craft union. These are tradesmen. These are skilled workers who have the power to shut a factory down. These are like electricians and mechanics. Keep the assembly line going. The CIO is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and this is a brand new union. It's called an industrial union. The idea is very simple. If everyone walks out, the factory will shut. And you see a major strike at the Fisher Body plant in Flint, Michigan, where the General Motors is going to agree to recognize the UAW. This is after the CIO goes on strike. And the number of UAW members skyrockets from about 30,000 to 500,000 in a calendar year. So labor unions are gaining huge ground during the Great Depression with a favorable administration. Remember, Section 7A under the NRA is allowing labor unions, and later the Wagner Act is allowing labor unions. Be familiar with John Steinbeck, probably the most famous artist of the 30s. Some of his books, The Grapes of Wrath, the Indubious Battle, Tortilla Flats, Of Mice and Men. These are all books that are mostly about the Okies and Arkies, these refugees from the Dust Bowl on the Great Plains moving to California, and they're being oppressed, they're being exploited by the large, essentially California plantation owners who are busting up any attempt at solidarity. So Steinbeck is on the side of unions, on the side of these poor farmers against economic exploitation. The Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl is this drought that lasts from 1934 to 1940. It's a long-lasting drought that dries up about 100 million acres in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. And farmers are going to head to the cities, and many of them head to California, which doesn't have a drought going on. John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics. Keynes is going to argue And this is a big name in economics. He wins the Nobel Prize in Economics in the 1930s for arguing that if there is a depression, the government as the source of money, the first spender, should deficit spend. This goes against this idea that you should balance the budget. Hoover tries this, Roosevelt tries this early on, and Keynes says no, the government should deficit spend, get the pump primed, have this ripple effect where the government hires people, for example, in a works project, those people have money, they spend it, and later on, when everybody has full employment, maybe you raise taxes then to pay off the deficit. But where does all this money come from to pay all these people? Well, there's going to be taxation on the rich will rise, but largely a major Republican criticism is that the government is driving the country into debt, into deficit spending. Some similarities of the New Deal with progressivism. Remember, the presidents are Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Well, one negative similarity is there's nothing specifically that's addressing racism. And to get the Southern Democrats on his side, FDR doesn't address lynching. He doesn't push an anti-lynching bill. But a difference is you have hundreds of thousands of black Americans will get jobs under the WPA and the CCC. And both the progressives and the New Deal are pro-labor. Under the progressives, you have Teddy Roosevelt intervening on the side of the anthracite coal miners. You have a Department of Labor added on to the Department of Commerce. You have the Clayton Act, which does not allow use of an anti-monopoly law to beat up on labor unions as a labor monopoly. And the progressives are pro-environment. You've got all these national parks and forests that are set aside. And the AAA and the CCC are going to do environmental protection, and the AAA is going to have lots of planting of trees out on the plains for windbreaks for farms, so you don't have this destruction of the topsoil by wind. Some differences with the New Deal and between the New Deal and progressivism. Remember, progressivism is about sort of shackling industry. It's not about providing jobs. There's no public works under progressivism. The progressives expand voting, and that's not a concern in the New Deal. Remember, under progressivism, you've got the initiative, you've got the referendum, you've got recalls on the state level, you've got the Australian/secret ballot. And on the federal level, you have two amendments. You've got Amendment 17, which has direct election for senators, and the 19th Amendment, where women vote. So that's a big difference with the progressives, the concern for expanding the electorate. And the progressive era takes place during a time of prosperity. So remember, there are all these limits on railroad rebates and on Sherman Antitrust and the Clayton Antitrust Act. You've got the Federal Reserve, which is putting limits on bank loans, setting up the Federal Reserve. And the New Deal takes place in a time of economic collapse. And you have the legalization of labor unions specifically, not something that specifically is a government action during the progressive era, although there is sympathy towards unions. So some thoughts there. You might want to look over your notes in your workbook, Unit 9 on labor unions. There's a specific list of things that the progressives do for labor. So some thoughts there. Study early, study hard, and just so you know, if you're watching this, you're my class, make sure I'm going to have, at least on one page, a chart, and you're going to have to explain what some of these alphabet soup acronyms are and what they did, and whether these are relief, recovery, or reform. So know some of these acts and the appropriate agencies or administrations that the acts set up. All right, signing out.